increasingly important.
Thank you. Now, am I on video and can everybody hear me? If you can't hear me, you probably aren't able to come back and say so, but let's hope you can.
Sorry, that's me.
This has been an exceptionally good turnout, and I'm delighted about that. And I want to bring fraternal greetings from the Council of the National Secular Society, who asked me to say to you all how much we value North East Humanists being affiliates of the National Secular Society, and to send our best wishes to all of you this evening. The subject of the talk is how secular is Britain, and I'm going to go at quite a pace because there really is quite a lot to get through, and I want to make sure that we have ample time for questions later. So, we probably all know about the census and the quite dramatic differences there were between the figures on religion and non-religion between 2001 and 2011. And that was that in the 10 years, the proportion of Christians dropped from 72% down to 59%, and the non-religious a staggering 15 to 25%. And the statisticians are adamant that that means that some of the people who ticked the Christian box in 2001 most certainly didn't in 2011, which is fascinating. And I think it's a reflection on people feeling more comfortable about declaring their non-belief. There is another measure, though, that I think is more accurate, and that's called the British Social Attitudes Survey. And that actually hits 50% for the people who don't consider they have a religious affiliation. So not only are we the biggest single group and have been for a long time, but we're actually equal to all of the others. And tracking that figure for the social attitudes going back the last 20 years or so, in fact back to 1983, is stunning. It shows that while the non-religious started then at 30%, they are now roughly 50%. And almost an exact mirror of that has been the Christians, not just the Christians, but the Church of England Anglicans, who have dropped from 40 down to roughly 20. And most of the other figures in there, which are for other Christian, Roman Catholic, and non-Christian, haven't moved that much. So it really is a swap between nominal Anglicans and the non-religious, which is, I think, a fascinating comment on what has happened in this country in a generation. And then we look at church attendance. They're all three different measures of the same kind of thing. You might ask why the Christian figure is so much higher in the census, and the census must be right, mustn't it? Well, it kind of depends on the question. And we're convinced, and we would be, wouldn't we, but the academics agree with this assessment, that the census has been calculated, the questions and even the order of the questions has been constructed in such a way that has the effect, and I personally think quite deliberately, of harvesting the greatest number in favour of religion and, by implication, Christianity. And why it's so much larger is that the way they ask these questions and the sequence in which they do brings out people who are cultural Christians. And that's the people who want to say, well, actually, I'm Christian, I'm not Muslim, or I do have values, and those are Christian values, which probably aren't too different from most golden rule values, except over things like homosexuality, where it's the official line, if not from the people in the pews, is pretty dreadful. So we started off with the highest number being the census. We move to the lower, well, for the highest number of Christians, then a lower number for the British Social Attitude Survey, and then we go to church attendance. And my goodness, that makes quite a difference. And so how about this as percentages of the British population attending on a normal Sunday? So we start in 1990 with 10%, and we're now roughly just a bit under 5%, and an official statistician's analysis of this is in 2050 that'll be 1.30%, 1.3%. And what's fascinating about these statistics is that if you ask people in surveys how often they go to church, the figures they give, and you multiply them out, end up with at least twice the attendance than you get from actual bums on pews from the church's figures, which is fascinating. There's another hidden message in this, which is that the church attendance is changing institutionally, in that the major institutional churches, the Anglican and the Catholic churches, are going down very strongly, but the other churches, the sort of charismatic and other churches, are actually rising as a proportion. And as secularists, we actually think that that is potentially better, because they don't have the institutional power that the Catholics and the Anglicans clearly have. So if we move from the institutional side to the what individual people think, there are some very encouraging figures, which I've taken from reputable polls. 81% of people agree with the statement, religious practice is a private matter and should be separated from political and economical life of my country. 76% of people said that religious leaders should not influence how people vote in elections. 71% said religious leaders should have no influence over the decisions of the government. 65% said people in Britain would not be a better place if more religious leaders held public office. And just 2% disagree with the statement that the law should apply to everyone equally, regardless of their personal beliefs. Perhaps I should have said 92% do. More oppose than support the idea of the UK having an official state religion. And 32% of people oppose there being seats reserved for Church of England bishops in the House of Lords. And 25%, I ought to say in good faith, are in favour. So I think the reason for that being closer is that a lot of people just don't understand that issue. And I think it's tradition, isn't it, etc. But I do have to say that the United Kingdom is the only country in the world, apart from Iran, with such an arrangement. So there's overwhelming support for religion being a private and not a public matter. 79% strongly agree or tend to agree with that. 4 in 10 Christians oppose the costs of hospital chaplains being met from NHS budgets. And And that, I think, for Christians is actually quite interesting, that there is such a strong undercurrent of concern about that. So 46% approve of sexual relationships between two adults of the same sex, and 62% of an adult woman's right to have an abortion within the legal time limit, and 59% on assisted dying. We're near the end of these statistics, and I was particularly interested that Christian worship is not strongly supported, with almost as many Christians opposing it as in favour. And the BBC's religious programmes are the least watched and listened to. Now that gives a very comforting feeling about the secularity of people. But it's not all quite as rosy as that, because I'm afraid there haven't been surveys of what I'm about to say for all of the religions, but there was one in 2016 on Muslims. And I'm shocked to say that only a quarter think that homosexuality should be legal. It was rather a poorly worded question as to whether that was homosexual acts or just being gay. It's interesting within those figures to see where the greatest degree of objection is and greatest degree of acceptance. And the acceptance is greater of homosexuality amongst Muslims in the 18 to 24s, which is encouraging, women, which I think is predictable, and C1 class, that's kind of skilled working class. And it's interesting that those are the areas too where homosexuality is more accepted in the population as a whole. It's fascinating, this C1 being almost in the dead centre of the socio-economic scale, where you have both the people further up and further down, whichever way you want to look at it, are actually more conservative. Similarly, women are more accepting than men, and younger people. So that's an interesting mirror. Although I do have a caveat to that, which is that there is a disturbing, growing element of extreme conservatism in young Muslims, which is also mirrored in a much smaller number of young Jewish people. And that is quite something. Just they have these communities where they have schools that are totally for their own communities. They basically don't interact with the rest of the community. The women are regarded as baby-making machines and not encouraged to go to university or anything like that. It's actually quite frightening. So whether that, albeit that the 18 and 24 group is more liberal than others, whether that number will start to drop, I wouldn't be surprised. And that's an issue which, as it happens, I was talking to the vice presidents of the European Parliament and the European Commission about in the last couple of weeks. I was invited to give some views in the Cabinet Room of the European Commission about the forward direction of the European Commission. I have to say I was slightly surprised, of the European Union, I was slightly surprised still to be invited despite Article 50, but anyway I was, and we've got a good reputation there, and I think they wanted to hear what we had to say, or I had to say, and I was making the point that in future there was a danger in the long term to the European Union where the proportion of people that supported fundamental values, which we rather arrogantly call British values, was going to drop with the higher incidence of immigrants and the higher proportion of Muslims from larger families. And that's something that they ought to actually take into account and that I made the point that one of the best ways of allaying that was to have integrated schools, something that I think most of you in this room would agree with. Although I had to admit, given it had just been, Mrs. May had just had to do a deal with the DUP, that in Northern Ireland, actually, I didn't think we should preach too strongly to them, because that's exactly the problem we have in Northern Ireland. Despite 30 years of fighting for integrated schools, only 7% of pupils actually go to them, and I guess it's the 7% that least need to. And of course, you then move that across to schools that are not just sectarian, but also mono-ethnic as well as mono-religious, and you have a problem of a different order. But it was interesting that the Vice President of the Parliament, charming Marion McGuinness, initially said, well, there's a religious freedom problem. And I said, Marion, I'd said publicly funded schools, and you could see her thinking, oh, he's got a point. And indeed, interestingly, I'm going to come along at the end to see what they're doing in Ireland, which is where she comes from. And they have actually clocked this issue, and they're starting to do something about it, but a bit like Northern Ireland, too late, too slow, but at least they're trying. So that's a little bit about our conflicting values and minority faiths. There were just a couple of other dimensions which I found interesting about who was involved in these, and I did discover to my surprise that in the Yorkshire and the West Midlands they were much more accepting, the Muslims, of homosexuality, which I'm just using as a kind of litmus test, compared with Wales and South West and East. And I thought long and hard about that and came to the conclusion it was probably some kind of metropolitan effect. That if you're in a big city, you probably are associate and cannot but associate with a much broader group of people that are potentially more liberal. On the other hand, what I found deeply worrying was that of the 900 people in this sample, about 50 favoured terrorism and extremism. I admit extremism means different things to different people, so that may be meaningless. And stoning, similarly. And an even higher number, round about 75, for a caliphate. An even higher number, 140, sympathetic to violence. So I think we need to think long and hard about the implications of these figures and what we do about them. And I think part of the answer is the same answer that I gave to the European Parliament, which is integrated schooling. And Mrs. May is going in the opposite direction. As you probably know, she's just lifted a 50% cap on religious schools to please the Catholics. So, I think the conclusion, notwithstanding the point about the Muslims, is that we are very much a secular society. And I don't think we're what the former Secretary of State for Communities, Eric Pickles, called we are a Christian country. I think, I'm sure there's a lot of origin in there, but often these values that are described as Christian aren't exclusively or even originally Christian, as you know more than anyone. So I'd like politicians to take careful note that 78% that Christianity would have no or not very much influence on the way that they vote in general elections. And I get rather irritated with Mrs. May. I'm sorry, this is not a party political point, but because the NSS is party politically neutral, as it is on Brexit, which is that she's saying, oh, well, Christians should speak out, you know, and she says this is the Prime Minister in Prime Minister's Questions. Well, I wonder what she'd say if there was a non-religious Prime Minister who decided to use parliamentary questions to say, right, well, I think all you non-religious, and let's face it, we're the majority now, I think we should just tell everybody else what we think about religion. And she would be the first person to say that Prime Minister is abusing their position. But somehow, if it's Christian, it doesn't seem to matter. Similarly, when she was in the Middle East, supposedly power broking, if we're to believe that, and a silly storm in a teacup came up about whether Cadbury's eggs were called Cadbury's eggs or Easter eggs. She managed to pontificate on that, rather than perhaps even talking about Christians being persecuted in these countries, and obviously that seemed to be more important. That's fractionally unfair, because I'm sure a reporter probably put the question in her mouth, but nevertheless it was that should even be discussed in such a place seemed trivial, to say the least. Richard Dawkins said, from some of these statistics that I've mentioned, Britain is a secular society with secular humane values. There's an overwhelming support for these values, even among those who think of themselves as Christian. Just as importantly, there's also deep opposition to the state promoting religion in our society. When even Christians are overwhelmingly opposing the intermingling of religion and state policy, it's clearly time for the government to stop doing God. And that was fascinating about Alistair Campbell saying, almost interrupting Blair and saying, we don't do God. And of course it was the biggest lie ever. And we've had real problems with that. I can certainly remember an extraordinarily sad occasion where I went to the Cabinet Office when the precursor of the Equality Act was going through, religious and belief organisations, to say that to the Secretary of State for Equality there, that, who's called Barbara Roach, that we really ought to have as few religious exemptions as possible in the equality legislation, and because the more there were, the more the non-religious and indeed the were disadvantaged, and the more Christians were privileged, and that it wasn't justified. This was supposed to be an Equality Act. And she completely agreed with me, and she said, I'll go and tell Tony, her exact words. A fortnight later she was sacked. And I still personally feel slightly guilty about that, because I actually, because we campaigned very hard and successfully, and I'd rather felt that she'd paid the price for that. So there is a lot of religious influence in government, and that I think is an example. I mean, Tony Blair, I discovered in this really high-level negotiations we were doing, I suddenly realised from the speed and confidence of the responses we were getting from the ministerial team, that the echo sound was so quick, it was coming from somewhere very high, and it was Blair. You know, I was going in saying blah 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 blah. They were going to Blair overnight and coming back to me. It was just breathtaking. He took such a close interest in it, as he did with the appointment of bishops. Apparently everything went on the back burner for that. It was absolutely extraordinary. And it was largely negative. He was relatively okay on gay rights, but on everything else, give the religious everything they want. It was, I have to say, quite depressing. I mean, I got really frustrated at one moment. I said to them, well, give me one good example of where a commercial organisation should legitimately be able to discriminate on religious grounds. And they'd obviously done some homework to anticipating the question, the answer was pretty pathetic. Oh yes, a garage, a car selling garage, selling cars only to missionaries, to which I'm afraid I said in which position. But there we are. Pretty depressing. And I think we need to just be conscious of how much religious influence there is right at the top of government. And I think actually that the procession of religious prime ministers, with the possible exception of John Major since Margaret Thatcher and including Margaret Thatcher, has been a major, major problem for the secular movement and the secularity of our country. After all, we are the only countries in the world with daily collective worship. And I was astonished when I'd worked really hard, as was mentioned earlier, on the abolition of the blasphemy law. When we did all the homework and we got the debate down and the amendment, and I was watching, it was in the Commons chamber and watching events very carefully. And when the amendment came up, there was almost a fracas going on the floor of the House. I couldn't work out what was going on. There were people running around like headless chickens round the centre of the chamber. And I'd never seen anything like it. And what had actually happened was that we put down this amendment and the government suddenly thought, blimey, they might win. It was so reasonable what we'd said and so unarguable, they'd suddenly taken fright. And they went to the MP who put down the amendment, an honorary associate of ours, and said, we'll give it to you in the Lords, but please, please take it off of the table. It's too much of an embarrassment for the established church. And you couldn't make it up, and clearly I didn't. And they were prepared to actually offer it to us without any argument, not even a vote. They'd give it to us in the Lords, as long as we didn't embarrass the established church. And just later that day, by a bizarre coincidence, I came across the bishop, one of the leading Anglican bishops, who I know quite well. And we just sort of mentioned this, and he said, oh yes, we're going to go away and consider what our answer is going to be. I said, Richard, don't bother. There's only one answer, and it's yes, that's okay. And he looked sort of slightly, what are you saying? I said, you aren't being asked. You're being given an opportunity to gather your dignity. But if you come back and say no, the government are going to say no to you. You have to say yes. And he knew me well enough to take it. And then we happened to meet again a week later, and he said, I'm afraid you were absolutely right. Which is exactly what it was. And I have to admit, I didn't believe the government, and we still put down an amendment in the Lords, just in case they didn't. But to be fair, they did. But then it was accompanied by the most excruciating speech, saying, oh, well, of course, this isn't the first thread of disestablishment, and the church is terribly important to the country. And well, you get the idea, don't you? So that's another indication from kind of behind the screen of the sort of position of the government. And I certainly don't think it's any better with Mrs. May. And I was on radio last night over the leading Conservative MP putting down in Prime Minister's questions one about the lifting of this cap, which hasn't actually been announced yet. And Mrs. May was saying, well, of course, we want to have as many religious schools as possible, you know. So, you know, it's pretty grim. So the NSS's response to this is to push very, very hard. But we've also been thinking strategically about the extent to which we appeal just to non-religious people or more widely. And the NSS has, throughout its history, had a degree of argument or debate about where we go on that spectrum. Right back at the beginning in 1866, we're celebrating our 150th year, we had one of the co-founders called Holyoake who was actually saying, well, it isn't really just about atheism, whereas the president was very much a campaigning atheist. And I only recently discovered that he learnt Greek and Hebrew amongst his languages, and I suddenly realized why he learnt Hebrew, which was that he was never prepared to take the party line on the interpretation of various bits of the Bible and wanted to know for himself. And I think he probably discovered a few things that people wished he hadn't. But so there's always been this kind of tension in the NSS, but we have made a definite decision in the last 5 years to move towards being an organisation that includes religious and non-religious people, rather than banging the atheist drum all the time. And I think that's, we think it's a positive development. I'm happy to acknowledge that the significant majority of the membership is and remains non-religious. But as part of the political strategy, just excluding anyone who isn't non-religious doesn't seem a terribly bright idea, because the NSS is actually about equality of rights. It's not about that religion is all rubbish, but more about which we could all argue about, and I'm not sure how many people you ever managed to persuade in those kind of discussions. But this is about, I think, a higher principle about equality for all, regardless of what their religion or non-religion is, and that is why we made that that change. And because we were always, and never quite get rid of it, but falsely equated with atheism and the opposition to religion, which I kind of gives an extra point to the people on the other side, which we'd prefer that they didn't have. Actually, our founder was also a Republican and an advocate of birth control, and very much ahead of his time. And oddly, out of all of those three characteristics, the one for which he was least popular was the advocacy of birth control, particularly as he published it together with the Vice President Annie Besant, who's got a proud Labour history, the Bryant and May match strike, and many others. It's been them having nearly gone to prison for publishing this sort of sixpenny leaflet or whatever. The objection was, it's all right to do a middle-class hardback book, but to send something out to the masses is quite different, and we'll get you for that if we can, and they nearly did. So we're trying to get away from the adjectives of intolerant, extreme, aggressive and militant, but I think a lot of people deliberately misunderstand secularism, and if they can't find a legitimate way of arguing against us, they just resort to the non-legitimate and ones that they know aren't true. So when we were changing, we had to think about what kind of secularism we wanted, and there are a few on offer. And the two obvious different ones are the laïcité, the French one, which is really based on horror about the way the church behaved until 1789 and an awful lot later, and it was sort of reaction to that. Or the American concept of separation of church and state, to which we're a little nearer, though the real reason for the American separation of church and state was actually to protect religion rather than the opposite, because they realized how overbearing the established church was, and it tried it in America. I've seen evidence of that. And it was saying there should be no established religion, and it was trying to give everybody a fair shot rather than give one religion the top dog status. And so we probably moved slightly in that direction, but I think we need our own definition. And certainly what we don't want is multi-faithism, and that to me is the absolute nightmare, with the 26 bishops in the House of Lords suddenly become those of numerous religions, and I don't know who'd go there for the atheist contingent of that. The reality is there wouldn't be one, and of course it's double representation for religion, because it was the people who go there bring their religion with them, and you put the bishop's bench and you get it again, which is entirely the intention, I'm sure. And historically the House of Lords was indeed almost entirely bishops and priors and whatever, certainly in the majority, which is pretty shocking. So the National Secular Society is working for very much in education, where we've done a lot of work on admissions and collective worship, and I think it's going in the wrong way at the moment with the government and multi-academy trusts, where if there's one religious school in there, they can get a lot of money, a lot of representation on the board, and it really is quite worrying, both from an admissions perspective, the pupils' perspective, and also for something I've worked a lot on, which is the discrimination against people not of the faith as teachers. And that is absolutely scandalous, and we're convinced that it's in breach of the European directive. But trying to get the government to acknowledge that, and trying to get Brussels to really bang hard on that, is quite difficult, because there's a very duplicitous way that the government argues against that, which is, oh well, the legislation that says that you can discriminate in that way needs to be read in conjunction with the directive, which basically means you can't do it. But will they change the law that's at face value contrary to the directive? No, they won't. And so it's really, we've spent a lot of effort on that, not alone, and nobody's managed to get these laws changed. So secularism for me is very precious, and I was rather taken by the former Secretary of State for the US saying that what we need is for Syria to be a secular state, and I thought that rather said it all. Other things that the NSS work in is freedom of expression, and I'm going to shock you by saying that we work with the Christian Institute on that, from not Jesmond, I think, and I'll work with anybody who will help me get to my objectives. And that's been a curious arrangement, in that clearly the membership is mutually exclusive, but there's a plus in that, is to the extent that you can get the NSS, well I'm talking mainly about in Parliament, if you can get the NSS contingent and the Christian Institute contingent working together, you just about got it. And there have been several major successes we've had in the Houses of Parliament on freedom of expression that break the laws that are in political science. We've actually won against the Conservative and Labour Party on the other side, at front bench level, which any book on political science will tell you you can't do, but we did it. And on an amendment to the Public Order Act. So it's interesting. So that's something that we work on, and as I say, I'll work with anybody who help me get, or get us to get to our objective. Now, we've talked a lot about secularism, and I wanted to say how we had moved the NSS into secularism, and just read out to you the secular charter. And this may come up in questions, but I suspect not many of you are going to disagree with this. But we're looking for a secular state where there is no established state religion. There's one law for all, and its application is not hindered or replaced by religious codes or practices. Individuals are neither disadvantaged nor discriminated against because of their religion or belief, or lack thereof. Freedom of expression is not restricted by religious considerations. Neither the state nor any emanation of it expresses religious beliefs or preferences. Religion plays no role in state-funded education, whether through religious affiliation, organised worship, religious instruction, pupil selection, or employment discrimination. The state doesn't engage in, fund or promote religious activities or practices. Public and publicly funded service provision does not discriminate on grounds of religion or belief. There's only two more. There's no religious privilege in society or advantage in law for any individual or group by virtue of their religion or belief or lack thereof. And the state does not intervene in the setting of religious doctrine or the running of religious organisations. Now, in a sense, the last one is a limitation on us, and I think that's part of the legitimate quid pro quo of this deal. And so we actually don't think that the state or anyone else should be interfering in religious doctrine. And of course the state potentially does in this country with the established church, in that if you want to change the Book of Common Prayer, which I don't suppose many of you do, but if there is a change to that, it actually has to go through Parliament, which may shock some of you. But that is the state that we are in, and that all of the disciplinary measures and all of the kind of rules of the Church of England have the same status as any other Act of Parliament. And the courts that the Church have now, fortunately, without any jurisdiction over any of us, are, in the eyes of the Lord, have just as much legitimacy of courts as any other court, which is pretty mind-blowing, really, but I'm afraid that's the strange position we're in. And the big period of reform was really in the middle of the 19th century, where there was an amazing amount of legislation on, for example, marriage and divorce, the civil registries. I mean, the church even dealt with probate, no doubt just of rich people, but that was that. They were the ability for them to be able to impose compulsory church rates was stopped. Their ability to administer justice was stopped. You may have heard the expression bawdy courts. They basically had a lot of churches, even prisons, actually run by the church. And it's not very long ago. So that was a big period of reform. And I think we're due for another one, or rather overdue for another one. So I want just to say one other area. There are lots of others, and there are annual reports and bulletins around which I hope you're going to pick up, which show the duplicity of things that we do, variety. Reference was made at the beginning to child abuse, and it's not something when you started this job you think that you'd ever have anything to do with. But how we've got into it is that it's very clear that there's virtually no other organisation except some dedicated child protection organisations, that not many of whom have got a great deal of political savvy, but some have, are actually standing up to make sure that the religious privilege of religious organisations being able to get away with it on a massive scale is fought. And we've actually taken on that mantle. It's not a very pleasant mantle to take on, I can assure you. Some of the stuff is disgusting beyond belief. But the kind comment that was made earlier about the Roman Catholic Church, we spotted that the Roman Catholic Church had decided to become a signatory to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child for, I'm convinced, quite in our terms, inappropriate reasons. I think it was trying to get the definition of the inception of a child's rights to the time of conception rather than the time of birth. But a consequence of that was that they signed up to the convention, which meant that questions like child abuse, etc., were things for which they could be held accountable. In their noddy state, oh no, I beg your pardon, we are have a special status at the United Nations, so I take that back into the state to which they are. They have a position around the table at the United Nations, and that they are the Roman Catholic Church is in a position where, because of the fact that it's state, then it can have secrets and documents and everything in the Vatican which are inaccessible to everyone else, and it can say that it won't release this information, and really that is beyond secular law. So we did actually get, with a series of interventions and work over about 7 years, to a situation where the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child did a report on the as it's called, the Holy See, which is, you can look it up on the web, extremely damning. So that's something that we were pleased to have played a major part in. And they aren't any way out of the wood yet. I mean, and just in the last couple of weeks, the number 3 in the Vatican has had to go to Australia to face the music on not just the cover-up of over 4,000 cases in a Royal Commission. That was yesterday's news. The latest one is that he's actually going to a magistrate's court for his own abuse. Of course, he's innocent until he's proved guilty, but when he was a young priest. But the whole situation for the Catholic Church around the world is dreadful. And they continue, both Catholic and Anglican, as I know from lawyers I speak to a great deal, to play hardball with everybody, even when it's perfectly obvious, and we know they know, that the victims are genuine victims. So the victims don't get justice, and indeed the perpetrators, they don't get justice either, because every attempt is made to keep them out of court. So we just keep fighting on that. And I had originally thought that the Anglican issue would be very much less of a problem than the Catholic one. But well, it is on an absolute level. But what I don't think many people realise is the scale of the Anglican abuse stories which are about to come in front of you in the next year or so. It will be jaw-dropping. And I think that the Anglican Church is in really, really big trouble, because I think it is facing a multi-dimensional split over several big issues. That's one of them. Another one is women priests, which has come back into the thought to be sorted, not sorted at all. When they try and appoint men that won't appoint women priests, then there's a riot. So whatever they say in the synod, it don't work. So that's a huge issue. And on same-sex marriage, there's another terrible problem in that the hierarchy have set themselves against it. The people in the pews are relatively in favour of it, and a big piece of history was made yesterday in that the Scottish Episcopalian Church, which is effectively the Anglican Church in Scotland, agreed to make its first same-sex marriage ceremony, and ironically that was to two English guys who couldn't get that marriage here in England. And I think that is a big problem for the church, because they just, and it's this kind of fall apart that's a problem, where people keep trying to hold these two elements together when they're moving further and further apart. And I think in the longer term we're going to get that with the growing secular population in this country and the at the moment obstinate religious establishment that I've been describing. And possibly a new monarch, certainly the next generation of monarch, could be something which made that more likely. And maybe things will change faster from that point. I think that they might well do. And to end on an optimistic note, I was intrigued by two things I've just read in the last week. And they are that in South Africa, a high court has just ruled against the promotion of one denomination over another in public schools. And the ruling read, "Neither a school governing body nor a public school may lawfully hold out that it subscribes to only a singular particular religion to the exclusion of others." And it argued that religious practices at these schools resulted in the suppression of scientific teachings of evolution and a religious ethos that was a form of coercion and abuse of pupils' rights. Do I hear any boos? Apparently not. And the last one, dead on 8 o'clock as planned, is that the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Dublin, for whom I have a grudging respect, wrote in the Tablet, which is the liberal Catholic newspaper, that he was frustrated about the lack of progress in transferring patronage from Catholic schools in Ireland's primary school sector to non-Catholic patrons, warning that there's a stubborn reluctance in the church to change. Well, that's no surprise, but that he should actually speak out in that way, I think is actually quite positive. So I'm going to conclude by saying that the kind of campaigning that I've been talking about is really quite energetic, and I think we're really getting into, use the old advert, into places other people can't get, and speaking at quite high levels in places. In fact, there's increasing frustration in some places. We're speaking at such a high level we're not allowed to say where it was, which really is frustrating. But you know, that's usually we've talked to you, but you can't go out and say you've just done it. But actually, that's probably quite a sign of progress. But it all does take a lot of effort and a lot of money. And while we very much appreciate the generosity of members in their donations and their affiliation fees, we would urge as many as possible of you to actually join the society and contribute directly to that campaigning. And there are lots of leaflets around showing what we do, and we're just on secularism.org.uk, where you can join and perhaps put a £5 monthly donation or something like that, and that would be very much appreciated. So I hope you found that interesting, and I look forward to the questions. I've been warned about the questions, so I'm look forward to them.
Who has the first question?
Yes. I'm told that you all actually, you're young here as far as questions are concerned, so I've come with great trepidation.
John is just
Yes. Who founded the National Secular Society, and did Charles Bradlaugh, did he end up in prison in the House of Parliament?
Yes, that's true. That's an interesting story that you brought up, particularly on our 150th anniversary. And our founder was Charles Bradlaugh MP, who was a remarkable character and very much ahead of his time. He became later the Liberal MP for Northampton, and that he was very popular because Northampton was and still is to a degree, a shoemaking town, and the shoemakers were largely at that stage not in huge factories as they are today, but individual journeymen working often out of their own houses. And so him being a Liberal was quite relevant to their kind of small business ethic. But he was very much in favour of women's rights and this contraception side, which is a terrible problem in Victorian England, where families were having so many children and there was so much poverty. That was really, really important. And he was also distinguished because he became, eventually was called the Member for India, because he was actually talking about self-determination for India, way, way ahead of his time. We're talking about the end of the 19th century. And of course it was a long time before the empire was divested of India after the war. So a man of great vision. Also, when he joined up, partly I think for way before he became an MP, but to get some money, and he said he wanted to go to India. So of course they sent him to Ireland. We probably forget now that Ireland was then as much as of the United Kingdom as Newcastle and Glasgow are today. But what was so terrible was the way that the British forces and the British government treated Roman Catholics in Ireland. And not everybody, but certainly many. And what that manifested itself on was dreadful cruelty, and he was related how on one occasion he was asked as part of an army contingent to get some poor people out of their houses, and a woman came out and said, "I beg you to leave this another 5 hours or 6 hours because my father's dying," and he was told he couldn't do it, and the man was pulled out in his bed and died outside, and that left an indelible impression on Bradlaugh about really I think the evils of empire and intolerance of that way. So when he became an MP, he was actually very, very popular in Northampton, and got in relatively easily, went to the Houses of Parliament, and they wouldn't let him have a seat because they knew he was an atheist and he couldn't give the oath. Or they wouldn't allow him to take the oath because they knew he was an atheist. And so there was he was rejected, and there was a by-election called. And this happened actually 4 or 5 times. And there was an awful lot of extraordinarily vicious action taken against him. He was fined £2,000 for voting when he shouldn't have done. He was barred from the House. There was physical violence visited on him actually by the officers of the House. the lengths to which the opposition went to try and discredit him and victimise him were just absolutely jaw-dropping. And there was, as you've alluded to, an occasion where he was removed from the House and taken to a secure room in the tower under Big Ben. Big Ben is actually the Bell, now called the Elizabeth Tower. I always think about that when I pass every time. It's just too dreadful. And I was very proud as part of our 150th anniversary to be responsible for the commission of a bust to Bradlaugh, which was installed at a reception given by Parliament for us just at the end of last year, and it stands the statue just off Central Lobby in a very prominent place, and I have to say I'm very proud of that. And similarly, on the 9th of September, if any of you want to go to Manchester, we have the last event in our 150th anniversary celebrations, which is the unveiling of a huge portrait by the painter Sickert to Bradlaugh. And I actually really find this emotive too. It's him at the bar of the house, i.e. he couldn't get in. He was there just on the edge of the chamber and they wouldn't let him in. And it's a really moving painting. And so we're going there to celebrate this. It hasn't been seen for a generation at least, and we're having a reception there and some historical talks. So if you do want to come, it's only £5 to non-members, free to members, and it's a Saturday. I'm almost certain it's the 9th, certainly around then. It is the 9th. It's on there, yeah, of September, and I'd love for some of you to come if you can. So I think that answers most of your question.
This is it, Kate.
Sorry.
Gosh, I hate these things.
How do you feel?
It's all right. No, I was interested and surprised at what you said about the campaigning around child abuse and the fact that, I mean, not that the National Secular Society is well involved, but that other organisations actually are not as effective. Are you prepared to share some of the secrets of your success in that area, and you know what the differences are between the secular society and others?
I think there are several elements to it. I mean, certainly hard work. I mean, I'm not suggesting the other organisations don't work hard, but we do have quite a record in our work in Parliament and being very effective there. And that has been, and we've also been working at the United Nations for quite a while. Initially through IHU, which Barry and Jean are very great benefactors for, and more recently directly in our own right. I'm certainly known for kind of getting inside organisations and really finding out what works and who's important, and just really getting in there and doing things that other people frankly wouldn't dare to do. And I still remember it, that the first time I got up and speak at the Human Rights Council, there was an intern there and she said, you don't look the slightest bit nervous. I said, no, this is payback time. And when you go and speak at the Human Rights Council, you don't just, as some people do, just go and sort of, you've got your speech and you just gabble it off. You actually practice it 20 times. So you actually see people turning around to hear what you're saying. It's really important. So, well, that's just a small element, but you know, we involve with the people who are doing these things and find out what the power relations are, who you really do need to speak to, and what the real sticking points are, and speak to the Secretariat and all that kind of thing. It's just hard slog. But I did, and of course I'm saying 7 years, but 6 years, 11 months and 30 days of that, you're thinking this has been a complete waste of time, and why did we bother? Not quite, but you know, it's you really do have to keep going on, despite not being confident you're going to get there in the end. I think that's actually quite important. But it's also really the ideas thing of nobody actually thought, with one exception, and there was Catholics for Choice, the liberal organisation in the States, had just made the connection, but that they were, that the Holy See had signed up to the convention, but they hadn't taken it very far, and we sort of took it and ran with it. So.
My question, though, is, given the tie-up between religion and the consolidation of kingship in the emergence of the Middle Ages, and the continuing relationship between established churches of all sorts and religions of all sorts and monarchs, can monarchy survive the demise of religion? And will we do what Thomas Paine always said, declare ourselves citizens of the world and not subjects of Her Majesty?
Yes, that's a very perceptive question. There was a very talented American commentator who is a secularist called Ingersoll, who I'm sure you've heard of. And I'm not sure I'm going to get this quote exactly right, but it was something along the lines that the church and the monarch were both from the same egg, that they were vultures from the same egg. It's very clear that that certainly historically, that they've been mutually reinforcing each other. It's quite a neat arrangement. The monarch tells everybody they ought to go to church, and then the church say that the monarch is sort of divine right of kings and all that kind of thing. And it's surprising that in the coronation service there's some of the language in there is still very reminiscent of the divine right of kings. And I think it's an absolute outrage that the ceremony that legitimizes, introduces, makes the monarch is a religious service. And when one would hope that such an event, whatever one thinks about monarchy, would be something which would be very much more inclusive. And again, we distinguish ourselves in being virtually the only country left that actually does that pretty well. I think it's very, very regrettable. But I'm not sure about the extent to which these days that the monarch is so reliant on the church. I suspect not to quite the same extent, but I've no doubt whatsoever about the religious fervency of the Queen, or sincerity, if you want to put it that way. And possibly also Charles, although he did say that he wanted to be for faith rather than the faith, and defender of faith rather than effectively the Anglican faith. Which kind of goes back to my nightmare of multiculturalism. And so I actually really worry about that. I mean, I don't know whether we're going to skip a generation or how long, if he gets the crown, how long he'll have it. But I think we're into a very different area with the next generation of royals, who I was quite surprised to hear quotes not denied of Prince Harry saying that none of them really wanted to do it, which is quite something.
In the first half of your talk, you relied heavily on sort of surveys of attitudes and beliefs and belongings and things. It always puzzles me, you know, why people rely so heavily on such things, because they're not really very reliable. I mean, certain ideas are automatically linked, which really shouldn't be automatically linked. I mean, I know people, for instance, who believe in the existence of a creator God, but absolutely loathe the idea of being in an organized religion. Would they show up on surveys? And I've known lots of people in organized religions, and different ones too, who don't believe in any God of any description at all, but they wouldn't necessarily say so, because they'd face some rather unpleasant consequences from some very unpleasant people.
Well, I think that's a very perceptive question. I think the reason
the point I'm making though was that can you, do you not focus on what people do? You know, the number of people who actually attend a church service.
I did.
Yeah, but the other, you know, it's very easy to hide your interior world about what you believe. Even Archbishop Welby said that he sometimes doubts the existence of God, but I bet you he didn't mention that at the job interview. They'll only come clean. They'll only come clean if there are no consequences for them personally in there.
Yeah, I'm not. You've heard I'm from an accounting background, and I'm not blind to the inaccuracies and the potential manipulation of surveys. And I did say that the very straightforward question about how often do you get to church, you can test the accuracy of that, and it's roughly doubled. People lie very heavily. On the other hand, I was very careful to give a whole series of questions from different surveys and looking at different angles, so that I thought the very point that you made was kind of covered in that I looked at it from all sorts of different angles from different surveys. It was just to give an objective view from, rather than me saying this is what I think people think. And I think it's a lot more, you can get the extent to which people are more keen on a particular issue or less keen on it. And there's no other way than doing that than by than looking at the statistics and wherever you can to cross-check them in a way that I actually did. Yeah, I share your cynicism about some of those, and very much. I mean, there is a question about exactly how you ask the question and which questions you ask. And there are some, polling organisations who pro-religious organisations always go to, and you look at the tricky-dicky wording of the question. They put the bar too high and get the answer that they want. And I'm very conscious of that, and I try to avoid using those kind of surveys. But there isn't a way. I mean, as long as one looks at them, takes them with a pinch of salt and looks at a variety, I don't think there's any other way of actually getting a broad idea of what's happening and of trends. I think to the extent that you ask the same question over a long period of time, and you see an identifiable trend, then that's probably worth something. And that's the example that I showed you at some length in both the census and on the British Social Attitudes Survey. And I think those do mean something. However wrong the figure is, the way the trend is moving is likely to mean something, and it meant a great deal.
So we've got time for one quick question, which I promised to Barry now. So sorry, go on. You can talk to them.
Can you say something about the, are there any changes in the religious attitude of the BBC? Now, of course, I know you've been trying for many years to get a secular speaker on Thought for the Day, which we haven't been able to do. But are there any noticeable changes in the BBC, or is it just as for religion as it's always been?
Well, I'm afraid the answer to that is the answer you don't want. But I have to tell you my own experience, and our fights, including potentially through the law, on Thought for the Day are well known. It actually goes further than that. That the abuse of process in dealing with our very formal complaints on that is shocking beyond belief. So it's not even we don't get the right answer, they don't even go through the right process to give us the right answer. And some of the information I've got on that is absolutely hair-raising about I mean, one example I will give you, just to do it quickly, is where we asked the directors of the governors of the BBC about some question about thought for the day, and suddenly the head of religious broadcasting comes on the Today programme and gives me a gratuitous kicking and saying the answer is no. And you think, goodness, that was clever, wasn't it? Between 5 o'clock on Thursday night and 8 o'clock on Friday morning, having consulted all the governors, you know, it's just, you know, it just gives you an idea. And there have been lots of those. But I'm finding even as recently as, was it last week or the week before, I did 8 programmes on some question about religion, and the question had been mangled in favour of religion. And that happens quite often. Just a complete misrepresentation of what the issue was. And so you start off with a sort of a penalty of 10 points before you even start the question, because it just keeps going on, and it's always in the same direction. I mean, there was a classic case of, we just did a survey of the cost of hospital chaplains, and we'd gone to a huge amount of work to do this, and it was a very comprehensive, all over the country type, any health body that we could get to answer, we got and carefully documented it. And by an extraordinary coincidence, just at that moment, the BBC came out with a survey of hospital chaplains saying, oh, it's terrible, they're all losing their jobs, and isn't this awful? And so I went to the people who were saying that and said, oh, sorry, we've just done a survey, a really, really big one, that says quite the opposite. We'll share you our data if you show us ours. Would they do it? No, they wouldn't. And they did admit that their survey was much shorter, much smaller than ours was, but the fact they wouldn't even show it to us, I don't think shows the, shall we say, a very good attitude, or perhaps, well, let's just leave it at that. I think you can all draw your own conclusions.
Thank you very much, Keith. Very stimulating.